Okay, we're now being recorded. Welcome everybody to our Wednesday webinar. It's May 10th, and we are talking about bugs that bite with Emily Zobel, Extension Educator with University of Maryland Extension. We would like to thank today our collaborators as well as our sponsors of the Women in Ag programs. If you want to see the upcoming webinars or past archived webinars, you can go to the Extension site at www.extension.umd.edu/women in ag. We record our webinars and have them posted on there, as well as we have upcoming webinars throughout the year, every second and fourth Wednesday of the month. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to come learn about bugs that bite, vector arthropods, and how to avoid them. This webinar is being pre-recorded because I will actually be out of the country on March 10th. So feel free to rewatch this as many times as you'd like. Since it's not being done live, there will not be open questions, but my contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint. Feel free to send me an email if you would like a copy of the slides, or if you have any additional concerns or anything that you want to know about vector arthropods. I am by no means a medical professional, but I don't know the answer. I can get you guys in touch with someone who does. So I would also like to thank Dr. Michael Rout from University of Maryland, the Department of Entomology. He provided me with some of the information that is in these slides. So with further ado, we're going to dig on in. Okay, so why are we bothering to talk about vector arthropods? And well, first and foremost, they're a nuisance. And if you're a farmer, particularly doing something like agrotourism, no one wants to be bit. No one's going to come back to your farm for agrotourism if they're getting covered in bites. Likewise, your workers, even if you're not doing agrotourism, are not going to have a good work environment if they're constantly getting bit. This also goes for your livestock as well. A study found that cattle in particular put on less weight when they were being bothered by lots of mosquitoes, and it had nothing to do with the fact that they were getting transmitted a disease. It just had to do with the fact that the cattle was spending more time swatting at mosquitoes than they were chowing down on food and kind of just being cows. So they are in general a nuisance. More importantly, they are a vector for diseases, not only to us as humans, but also to our pets and livestock. These vectors take up our time, going to the doctor and being on antibiotics and all that, and this all takes time and money as well. And on average, over $712 million a year is spent in the United States alone dealing with vector arthropods and their diseases. We're also talking about this because it's kind of in the news. So last year, Zynga outbreak kind of hit, and it was everywhere in the news. And while it kind of calmed down in the news, it has the potential to come back up as we're entering into mosquito season. And we'll talk a little bit more about Zynga. And then, as well as the diseases themselves, when people go to control these arthropods, sometimes those have non-target effects. Particularly in South Carolina, this made news over here where they sprayed a bunch of insecticide to kind of kill mosquitoes in the middle of day, and it killed a lot of honeybees. So it was someone not making a smart choice on how they went about doing their mosquito control and killed a whole bunch of beneficials, and people kind of get really upset when you kill honeybees in particular. And the other reason that we kind of talk about them from an ecological point of view is, despite the fact that we hate them because they're a nuisance and they transmit all these vectors, is that they do actually serve an ecosystem role. A lot of these vector arthropods are food for a tremendous amount of animals, particularly birds and lizards, small mammals and stuff like that, as well as they do provide a population control. A lot of the diseases that they don't transmit to us, but transmit to, say, like rodents and all these other ones, work to control those populations in a more natural way. So from an ecological standpoint, we sort of care about them as well. So how this talk is going to basically be outlined is it's going to kind of be two small talks that are kind of crammed together. So first we're gonna go over some stuff about mosquitoes, their basic biology, how to prevent them biting, and then a little bit about their diseases. And then we're gonna jump over to ticks. So same thing, biology, prevention, ID, and diseases. So mosquitoes, there are over 180 species of mosquitoes found in the United States alone, and there are thousands found worldwide. There are 89 found here in the Mid-Atlantic region. For those of you who are tuning in from the non-Mid-Atlantic region, you can contact your local extension office if you're curious about how many are found in your state. But the more south you get, the more species you will have, and the more north you get. Normally it's the fewer species you have, but that doesn't always hold up for everyone. Most people don't realize this, but mosquitoes are actually a type of fly. So they are very closely related to the housefly that is buzzing around your house, and what have you. And they do take a wide variety of habitats, feeding hosts, and flight range. So even here in the state of Maryland, why we have, or even in the Mid-Atlantic, why we have 89 species found in the Mid-Atlantic, the same ones that are found in Georgia aren't necessarily the same ones found in Pennsylvania. The ones that are found on the eastern shore of Maryland are not the same ones that are found in the mountain area of Maryland. So some of them are very habitat specific. You've got marsh mosquitoes versus forest mosquitoes, you've got urban mosquitoes, and so forth. Some of them will feed on anything that they can find. Some of them are actually very host specific and only feed on one particular type. There's one species of mosquito that really only likes to feed on birds. There's another one that really prefers reptile blood. So they do kind of have this really great variation in them. And then they do vary on flight range. This is kind of important because when you go to control them, the ones that have really large flight range, you're kind of looking at it in a more large picture versus a lot of our urban mosquitoes, things like the Asian tiger and the yellow fever mosquito, have very small flight ranges. Most of them tend not to leave, go anywhere within 200 yards of where they were born. So in that case, you know that your control methods, as long as you're controlling kind of in that area, you've got a better chance of actually preventing them. The one thing that I do want to kind of cue people in on, let me see if I can figure out the pointer. I think it's this. Okay. So these are crane flies. A lot of people, next to the quarter here, a lot of people always come into my office and say, I found these giant mosquitoes. Or they think that these are the male mosquitoes, and they're not. They're crane flies. They're completely harmless. If you get one in your house, you can put a cup over it and a piece of cardboard underneath it and put it outside. They're actually pretty beneficial. They pollinate a lot of our night blooming flowers, so they don't bite. They're perfectly fine. Versus mosquitoes, which are those ones underneath the dimes, are a lot smaller. And one of these is the male and one of these is the female. It's kind of hard to see from the picture, but you can tell there's not really that much of a size difference with regards to them versus like a crane fly is much larger than a mosquito. So crane flies, not mosquitoes, two different insects. So they do have kind of similar life cycles though. So mosquito, it can take anywhere from 4 to 14 days for a mosquito egg to hatch, go through all 4 of its larvae in stage, then pupate and become an adult. And this is very temperature dependent. So with most insects, because they are cold-blooded, quote unquote, temperature plays a key role in there. So warmer, hotter days, they can go through this life cycle faster. This is why you'll get much quicker turnaround in the summer than you will in, say, the spring and the fall. Around here, mosquitoes will either overwinter as adults or eggs. And one female mosquito can lay up to 300 eggs for each blood meal she has. So every time you get bit by a mosquito, you can be happy knowing that you're going to produce 300 more mosquitoes. I know. Make you just warm and fuzzy inside? It definitely doesn't for me. But the larvae, like most flies, are aquatic or prefer damp environments. So they live in water, and it only takes about 1 teaspoon of water, and they prefer stagnant ponds over anything else. So really choppy environments and stuff like that, they don't particularly like because they breathe with these tubes at the surface. So if you look at the life cycle, circle off to the side here, you'll notice that each one of them has this little tube coming out of their rear end. That's their breathing tube. So they basically float at the surface, and that tube is what they use to get oxygen. So if it's a very ripply pool, the likelihood of them getting topped under or turned under increases. So they really do prefer stagnant ponds. Some of the more forest species don't necessarily even need a pond. Some of them can do it in leaf litter or in just the little puddles and bromeliad plants and stuff like that. So they really don't require a lot of water as much as just that moist environment in order to do this early stage of their life cycle. Oh, I skipped ahead too far. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, adults. So most people think that the adults are actually sucking blood for their actual substance, and they're not. Most mosquitoes actually feed on nectar for their actual nutrition, and males only feed on nectar. So male mosquitoes will never bite you. They only the female bites, and that's pretty much just because she needs that extra protein in order to make her eggs. On average, the species around here can live up to 100 days, we found in studies. Now, this, of course, doesn't include the fact that, they could get eaten by a bird or a bat, or they could get smushed by you, or lots of other things. So, on average, most of them don't live 100 days, but they have found that they can live up to 100 days, kind of in lab settings. Mosquitoes versus ticks, which we'll talk about later, are very quick feeders. They come in, they want to feed quickly, and they want to get out. But if given their time, they can actually feed for up to 4 minutes. And this picture off to the side has a great example of a mosquito kind of coming and landing and slowly taking up blood. And you can see the red in her as she takes more and more blood and she engorges herself over the course of about 4 minutes. After about 4 minutes, they tend to be pretty full and then they'll fly away. When a mosquito does come to feed, the first thing that it's going to do is insert its proboscis. You can kind of think of this as just like a hypodermic needle or straw. But once it's stabbed you with its blood, it's actually going to then try to find a blood vessel. It doesn't necessarily do repeated stabbings as much as it does one stabbing, and then it's the inner part of the proboscis is a little bit more like a bendy straw, so we can kind of bend a little until it finds that blood vessel. Kind of creepy, I know. There's some really cool videos for those of you who aren't squeamish if you ever want to see this. Once it's found the blood vessel, though, that's when it's going to release its saliva. And it's just going to release a little bit of it, but this mainly has an anticoagulant in it so that it'll be able to absorb your blood back up rather quickly. Sometimes this will have some stuff that'll kind of numb the area as well. This anticoagulant is what causes the itching, but the bigger issue to us is that this is when any pathogens that are in it, the mosquito, get put into us. And they don't release a lot of saliva, and there's not necessarily a lot of pathogens in there, but it only takes a little bit in order to make a big impact. Okay, so how do we go about preventing these little bloodsuckers from sucking on us? Well, I hate to break it to you guys, but you can't prevent them all. There's just no way. I have never met anyone in my life who's managed to go their entire life or even an entire summer without getting bit by one of these guys at least once. So, unfortunately, the goal here is prevention and reduction, not full on elimination. So, from a personal standpoint, you can wear personal protection. So things like clothing and repellents, you can reduce your exposure to them. And we can also work as a whole community to reduce the population through reducing their breeding ground, reducing the adult area, and then implementing things like biological or chemical control. Okay. So personal protection. So contrary to what people believe, mosquitoes can't actually bite you through clothing. So if you have on pants and long sleeve shirts, that's the majority of your skin already covered up. Loose fitting clothing works nicely not because it creates that air gap, although that is particularly helpful during summertime, but because when the little looser it is, every time you move, it kind of ripples the clothing a little bit more, which if you have a mosquito who's landing on you, trying to figure out why it can't bite you, that's enough sometimes to startle them away. Repellents are probably the most common things that people use in order to combat mosquitoes, and I strongly recommend using ones that have been scientifically proven to do this. So things like DEET is super effective. Um, Paracardan or iCardan are also really good, and then oil of lemon eucalyptus is a nice organic option for those of you who are trying to go a little bit more natural. Um, I would recommend using these over, say, something that you find on a blog or on the internet because these have been proven to work. Science has said these work and these work for X amount of time. You do need to read the label because how often they need to be applied varies. Oil of lemon eucalyptus needs to be applied every 4 hours versus DEET can go 8 hours before it needs to be reapplied. You also want to check whenever you're getting it that you know what concentration you're getting. So, for instance, like the family DEET sometimes is like 10% DEET in the actual aerosol can versus like the deep wood stuff is like 30% DEET. So it's the same chemical, it's just different concentrations. So that's something to take note of. Whenever you are applying this, you always want to put on sunscreen first. Uh, and you never want to put on any of these chemicals and then put on clothing. A little bit around like the edges of your pants or your shirts is fine, but there was a story, I want to say like 10 years ago in the news about a woman who basically sent her preschooler. She was gonna send her kids out to play, and she like had them take off their shirts, and she sprayed them down with DEET, and then she put their t-shirts on them and sent them out to play. And she did this every day for the whole summer. And then they found like DEET in her kids' bloodstreams, and it's like, well, you kind of caused this to happen. These chemicals work basically by creating like a barrier around your skin as they kind of precipitate into the air. So when you put clothing over that, you've trapped the particles that are in the air, and then that doesn't have any place to go. So that allows your skin to absorb it. If you're using it proper, your skin's not actually going to absorb any of it. So don't freak out. Just always make sure that, with the exception of a little bit around like the edges of where your clothing are, you never want to fully apply this really heavy and then put clothing on. Vapor repellents. So these are something that I always get people calling and saying like, how effective is this? They're sort of effective is the answer. So they basically produce a limited range. Citronella candles are everyone's classic one, and citronella candles work great if you're where the smoke from the citronella is. But if the candle's sitting on the top of your picnic table, there's nothing to stop the mosquito from going down and biting your ankles or your legs because that's not where the citronella is. So you kind of need to take these all with a grain of salt. So things like the thermal cell mosquito repellenter and the off mosquito lamp, both of these actually use insecticides in them. So the Thermacell uses Linaren, which is a pyrethrum, and you can see the mosquito off lamp also uses a pyrethrum. So these are particularly good if you're kind of doing camping stuff, but I wouldn't recommend necessarily using them every single day just on your backyard. You're better off just kind of wearing actual insecticide, like repellents, than actually doing these, just because while these things have these insecticides at very low concentrations, they basically create like a big net around them or a barrier. So you are breathing in some of these stuff. So again, camping, or like if your husband or your son or you are going out hunting, by all means use these. These are really effective in deep woods when you're hunting, but I wouldn't necessarily consider this as an everyday use to combat mosquitoes. Okay, things that do not work. There are no plants that will keep mosquitoes away. You can plant all of the marigolds you want in your yard. You can line all of your farm with them. Mosquitoes will still land on marigolds. They do not particularly like them, but there's no plant that will really honestly keep them away. They can fly over these plants and land on something else. It's plant these plants because they're beautiful and they have other benefits, but they're not really going to keep mosquitoes away. Bug zappers also not effective against mosquitoes at all. Most mosquitoes fly at dusk, day, or dawn, versus bug zappers tend to kill most insects in the middle of the night. Bug zappers, while they don't really work on mosquitoes, will kill a lot of beneficial insects as well. And a lot of times, any mosquitoes they do attract kind of get attracted to them but don't necessarily die. They kind of fly around them but don't actually get zapped because of their size. And a lot of people, I always have people be like, "Oh, I made this mosquito trap out of like yeast and stuff that I found online, and look at all the mosquitoes I caught." And then that's great, but I kind of feel like the mosquito traps are kind of like the Japanese beetle traps, where look at how many you caught, but how many of them did you bring in because of the trap? So I would probably not necessarily spend my time and money on these things. Instead, invest in some good repellents, and some good kind of like cover up gardening and or farming clothes, and you'll be fine. So as women in ag, a lot of us have kind of multiple roles. So on top of taking care of your family and the farm, a lot of us, you also are the ones mainly taking care of pets. My mom always jokes that whenever my sister and I as kids wanted a pet, she was the one who had to approve it because she was going to be the one basically taking care of it. So I wanted to include a little bit about our furry friends. So there are a fair amount of diseases that can be transmitted to your pets. Heartworm, West Nile virus, equestrian encephalitis, all of these pretty nasty ones. You basically want to talk to your veterinarian about them. You want to go ahead and get any vaccinations that you can get for your animals for any of these diseases, especially if you're living in an area where they pop up periodically. This can be shots or like heartworm pills. Stay on top of that kind of stuff for your dogs, and you'll be okay. Do not use DEET, tea tree oil, pennyroyal, or D-lemon. A lot of people think like, oh, if it's safe for me, it's safe for my dog, and that's really not the case. A lot of these chemicals have been found to cause all kinds of diseases in dogs and cats, from paralysis to liver problems to seizures to just all around kind of weakness. I think one of them causes degradation in bones. So you basically want to use things that are appropriate for these animals on their animals. You also want to keep them specific for each animal. If something says it's a dog only, it's only for dogs. If it says it's for cats, it's for cats. If it's for your horse, it's for your horse. So the best thing you can do is just talk to your veterinarian about it, and then stay on top of all of them. So for farm animals, again, it's the same thing. You want to talk to your vet about it, get any vaccines that you can possibly, because then it's one less thing that you have to worry about. The best thing that you can do for barns and stables, particularly for horses and cows, is to just put some box fans up in them. Mosquitoes are not particularly good flyers, so any kind of air movement that is coming around will definitely deter them from kind of staying there and being able to land or feed anything. Again, because they like that damp vegetation for reproduction, removing any vegetation from your barn and your stalls. So mucking those stalls out when you're supposed to is super beneficial to reduce not just mosquitoes, but flies in general from your barn. Standing water in pastures is another big one to reduce their numbers. And then using fly sheets or blankets. If you don't necessarily you can use sprays in baths as well, and then you can also use nets over the windows as well. So how can we reduce the population using biological control? So we can do this. The first thing, the best thing for to combat mosquitoes biologically is fish. Fish love to eat mosquito larvae. Mosquito larvae are like super yummy to them. They will gobble down hundreds and hundreds of these a day. So the picture here of the fish is called a mosquito fish, and they are just these tiny little fish that love to gobble down larvae. But goldfish, your common simple goldfish, will work just as well to kind of combat these ones. Insects and spiders love mosquitoes as well, and a lot of them will feed on all stages. So particularly in the wetlands, a lot of those marsh spiders are actually semi-aquatic, and they can grab these larvae out of the water and chow down on them. We also have one type of bacteria, which I'm actually not even going to try to pronounce, but it's BT basically. And what you can do is you can get mosquito dunks, which are these little donuts that are basically made out of corn, and then they have the BT protein mixed in with them. And this BT protein works kind of similar as it does on caterpillars and butterflies and our genetically modified crops by just preventing them from being able to make it to their adulthood stage. The other option that we have is the release of sterile male mosquitoes. So, and these are also called GMO mosquitoes, or genetically modified mosquitoes. So the use of sterile male methods has been around for a really long time. In the 1950s, it was used to basically eliminate the screwworm. The idea behind it is that you release a male insect carrying some kind of lethal gene, and the offspring that he produces when he mates with the wild female mosquito or insect, basically they don't survive. So traditionally, this was kind of done using X-rays or radiation to make the male insect weaker, but nowadays we found that we can do it through genetic modification, and it works a little bit better because whenever you're hitting the male insects with radiation to kind of make these lethal genes, you sometimes make them themselves weaker insects. So then they're just not as appealing to the female mosquito, and then it doesn't work quite as well. So the one type of GMO mosquito that was in the news last summer because they were talking about releasing it in Florida, I don't actually know if they ever did it or not, was one made by a British company called Oxytot. And you can see the larvae up here that glow. That's how they know the genes took, was because they'll glow as well. And basically what this mosquito has in it is an extra gene that makes what they call a T-tab protein. And this protein is not found in the mosquito saliva. So in the event that one of these mosquitoes did bite you, this protein would not be put in you. And even if this protein was put in you, it wouldn't really cause any damage because what basically they did is they made it so that this protein controls its own binding site. So the gene, if you can think back to like high school or college biology, we'll remember that like genes get transcribed and translated and they make proteins, and then the proteins can come back and bind to the site, and then they'll just keep making proteins. That's what happens here. So this T-tab protein binds to its binding site, and it basically tells the cells in the mosquitoes to make more of it. So then the mosquitoes end up making more and more of the T-tab protein, and they don't make the proteins that they need to survive. This is called a positive feedback loop. So for those of you who are kind of overwhelmed by the science, it's okay. Think of this as like if you owned a bakery. To be a successful bakery, you need to have cookies and pies and cupcakes and bread. Well, imagine if someone came in and they were like, I want pumpernickel bread. And you were like, okay, so you made some pumpernickel bread. And then you gave it to them, and then they were like, more. So you made more. And then you were like, more and more and more. So at some point, because you have limited resources, you only have X amounts of bags of flour and sugar and so forth. You weren't making cookies and cakes and cupcakes and pies. You were just making lots and lots of pumpernickel bread. That's kind of what happens here. So it ties up the cell's mechanisms and prevents anything else from being expressed. And this basically, in turn, causes the insect to die because it's got so much of the T-tab protein, aka pumpernickel bread, that nobody wants to buy that it goes under. So that's kind of how GMO mosquitoes work in a nutshell. Again, if you're super interested in this and you want more information on it, feel free to email me. My email will be at the end, and I can send you kind of more information about this. Okay, so the other more common way that people think of reducing mosquito populations is through chemical control. Now, a lot of times when we do control mosquitoes, we use what's called a broadband insecticide. And this is not necessarily the best thing because it'll basically kill a ton of our beneficial insects if it's applied during the daytime. That's why the majority of the mosquito control programs that you'll find in your cities tend to apply the mosquito chemicals at, say, like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. One, it's in part because it's nice and cool and there's less wind, but in two, that's when not a lot of your beneficials are out, so it's kind of a safe time to do it. Now, depending on the chemical and the weather conditions that you have, these chemical controls can work for several hours to several days. So the yard guard that you can buy at like Walmart and spray around, that stuff will normally last about an afternoon and or into the next day. Some of these other ones that like the counties will come and spray will last about a week or so. But they'll break down over time, and especially if it rains, they'll break down. Threshold wise, so think of this as like your action threshold. So when should you spray or when can you justify spraying? Most counties justify spraying if they have what's called a landing rate. So when someone's just standing in the middle of your yard, if during a 2-minute period 3 or more mosquitoes land on them, then you can normally justify spraying. You can also contact your mosquito control program for a list of suggested pesticides, as well as limitations on where and what you can spray, and contact them about if they will spray, for instance, like your street. Most of the times they don't actually spray farms, but if you are farming out in the country and you're living in like the more of the city area, sometimes they'll spray city areas. I do have off to the side here, I have a list of kind of common mosquito chemical controls that people use. But again, you want to go ahead and check with your county and your state if you don't live in Maryland to see what their recommendations are. Okay, so if you don't necessarily want to use chemicals, which most people don't like, one of the easiest things that you can do as a homeowner and as a farm owner is just reduce the population by eliminating the breeding ground. Again, a lot of these mosquitoes stay close to where they came, where they were reared. So just by eliminating these places, you can kind of cut back on them. Any water that's standing still for 4 days can be a breeding site for mosquitoes. So you want to prevent water from collecting. So this is things like making sure wheelbarrows and tarps are, tipped over or draped. Excuse me. So that water runs off of them. You can also check and remove any stagnant water. So, water underneath flour dishes or cleaning out your gutters so that they drain properly is a great thing. Drilling holes in tire swings. The inside of tire swings is a great little place for mosquitoes to hang out. Potholes and tree holes also can breed mosquitoes. And then if you've got things like pet dishes and bird baths, just dump the water and change it every day. You're probably changing it for your pets anyways, but try to remember to do it for bird baths or even like the little bit of water in hummingbird feeders. If that's out there for 4 days, that can breed mosquitoes as well. So some of the other things you can do is to prevent puddling around your buildings, your barns, your houses, and so forth, is you can collect that rainwater in things like rain barrels or rain gardens. Most rain gardens will get the water will precipitate to within 24 hours. That's good. If you are collecting in rain barrels, putting one of those mosquito dunks in there will go ahead and make sure that even if the rain barrel, if they can get into it and they lay eggs, nothing will happen. Drain pipes are really good for moving water away from your buildings, but you want to make sure, especially these corrugated ones like the one in this picture, each one of those corrugations holds exactly a teaspoon of water, which makes it perfect for a mosquito-sized breeding ground. So all you want to do is just take an old pair of pantyhose, stick them over the top with a rubber band, and bam, water comes out, mosquitoes can't come in. Now you're not having a breeding ground anymore. For your lawn, you want to make sure that you're not overwatering it to create these puddles, and also you want to make sure that you're not over fertilizing it. When grass in particular grows up really thick, and it creates kind of an ideal environment for the adult mosquitoes to hang out in. This isn't saying that you need a horrible lawn, but you don't necessarily need to over fertilize it, because that fertilizer will also run into any water source, which will allow mosquitoes to kind of they're filter feeders, so if there's fertilizer in there, there'll be plankton in there, and then from there they'll kind of go and go. If you have any low spots, you can just fill them in over time, and then maintaining a proper septic system is another good one. So on your pastures, you want to try to prevent as much mud as possible, so doing proper things like rotating your pastures or laying down straw. So in the bottom picture here, you can see it's super muddy around the horse trough. So all they have to do is kind of lay down some straw, and that'll clog up kind of those mud holes. You can also keep animals off of pastures when it's super soft. If you've got small troughs or buckets, again, just like the bird bath and your pet dish, go out there, dump them, refill them 2 to 3 times a week. For larger ones, like the one in this bottom picture, mosquito dunks, perfectly safe for animals. You can also put in a bubbler if you've got electricity near it. This will again create some ripples in the water. Mosquitoes want that nice, like even, steady thing. Or a lot of people have found that they can put fish in them. I will say if you are going to put goldfish in there and it's out in the middle of your field, you're going to want to put a cinder block in there as well because goldfish are going to need some place to get some shade so it doesn't stress them out. I have had people call in and say, well, what about my horse drinking goldfish water? And I go, well, it's perfectly fine. You know, I have gone, on trail rides, and my horse is drinking water out of a stream, and I guarantee you that there are fish in that stream that are pooping just as much as that goldfish is pooping in this one. So it's perfectly fine. Your horse is smart enough not to drink up a fish, and the fish is smart enough to be scared and go hide when your horse or your cattle or your sheep or whatever animals you have in your pasture come over to drink. So it's not really a concern. Don't necessarily be too worried about that. Okay, so for non-pasture fields, so you kind of just want to follow basic good agriculture best management practices. Don't over irrigate. One, that water puddles, and then you've got places for mosquitoes. But on top of that, uh, when you over irrigate, you're reducing your yields. You're allowing your nutrients to get leached into the soil, and that's causing problems. You'll That extra water will cause a flush of weed growth sometimes, and again, it decreases your soil quality. So if the water's not gone within 24 hours, you're overwatering. Um, you along the lines of not over irrigating, you want to make sure that your irrigation pipes are in good working order. If they're leaking, you want to fix them because again, you just want to eliminate all these puddles. You want to prepare your land so it slopes and has good drainage. If the event that you are doing vegetable or produce farming and you've got that black plastic mulch, that's perfect and it works great. But especially after rainstorms, a lot of times you'll find puddles on there. And if those puddles are there for, again, 4 days, they're a great spot for mosquitoes to kind of reproduce in. Um, More crucially is to install and maintain well-designed ditches. So ditches are kind of an ideal place for mosquitoes to breed, especially if you have ditches that have water in them, and maintain that water because that's what the ditch is there for. So you just want to make sure that you've got a well-designed two-stage ditch to keep the weeds down around them if all possible, because this is where adults are resting during the daytime, and then keeping the actual main channel open so that the water is flowing in it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to mosquito diseases, and I'm going to start off by saying I am not a doctor. This is not necessarily medical advice. I wanted you guys to have some exposure to it, again, because some of you not only have to deal with your health, but you're taking care of your kids and your husbands or significant others or animals on your farm and what have you. So I want you guys to have some exposure to this. If you have any concerns about any of this, I would seek out an actual doctor about it. Okay, so here are some really common mosquito diseases. We're not going to touch on all of them because this is only, well, it's probably going to be over an hour webinar, but we don't have all day here. So we're going to just hit on some of the high points. So the first one I want to talk about is dog heartworm. This is one that's pretty easy to kind of prevent. Most people give their dog heartworm medication, and it basically prevents these parasitic roundworms from invading their heart. So it's caused by a roundworm. The mosquito is kind of an intermediate host. So the mosquito will feed on a dog, and it'll get this parasite in it, and then this parasite will live in the mosquito. It doesn't really affect the mosquito, and then every time when the mosquito goes to feed on a different dog, when it goes for that bite and it injects its saliva, that's when a little bit of this roundworm, the larvae and what have you, will get into the dog, and then you've got these issues. So dogs are the primary host. Basically what happens is it infects the pulmonary artery of the heart. So if you look at the picture up in the corner, that is kind of gross. All these like spaghetti noodles that are in this heart basically are roundworms. And this basically clogs up the heart, and then it decreases the amount of blood that gets to your dog's lungs. Preventative measures are the best way to control this. So if your dogs or anything like mine, getting her to take a pill was like the worst thing in the world, and then she'd sulk because she'd be like, oh my god, you made me take a pill, and I'd be like, I'm sorry, but it's for your own good. So it's for their own good. It's for your own good. You want to go ahead and just do the preventive measures if you can. Most of the time, when dogs get this, they'll be perfectly fine for this first 6 to 9 months. The roundworms are in there and they're reproducing, they're breeding, and while they might start clogging the heart artery, you're not really going to see symptoms until it's almost too late. You'll start seeing them cough, they'll become exhausted really easily, they'll have all of a sudden they'll lose a lot of weight, they'll start fainting, they'll start coughing up blood, again because they're just restricting the airflow to their lungs. So they have a hard time running really long periods sometimes and stuff like that. So yeah. Okay, so Eastern equestrian encephalitis, also known as triple E, which I'm going to refer to it as now on, or sleeping sickness. So this is a virus. It's known to infect a fair amount of mammals. Dogs, pigs, bats, reptiles, amphibians, rodents. It will infect humans, and horses tend to be another big one for it. Birds are reservoirs, so again, the virus can stay in birds and live in birds and be perfectly fine. It doesn't kill the birds, but it will harm basically mammals. And what it basically does is it causes inflammation in the brain, and then this will in return cause lots of other side effects and potentially death. So animals will normally have signs within 2 to 5 days. It'll be things like high fever, depression or changes in behavior, impaired vision, muscle twitching, head pressing is a common one. You'll see, particularly in horses, their head will, they'll keep pressing their head against the wall or against a field post or something like that. They have a hard time swallowing, sometimes paralyzation and convulsion. So the survival rate with horses is actually pretty good. It's 70 to 80%. The downside of that is the non-survival rate is 20 to 30%. So it's definitely something that you want to go ahead and just have your animals vaccinated for. There's a vaccine for horses. There's not a vaccine for humans. Humans, again, can catch this. We have very similar kind of symptoms: fever, chills, body aches, headaches, disorientation, and eventually it can lead to things like seizures and paralysis, which can be very frightening and can actually end up leading to death as well. So just something to be conscious of. So Zynga, the one that has on everybody's minds basically. So this is a virus. It was found in the Zynga forest of Uganda in 1947. So that is right here on the world map where the number 1 is. Basically, it then kind of spread over throughout the rest of Africa and then made its way east to, we've got India and then the Pacific Islands, and then eventually to the outbreak that happened last year in South America. And they actually determined that the outbreak in South America is the Asian strand. So it did, in fact, go all the way from India all the way over. We did have some outbreaks in kind of some smaller areas in the past. So the Pacific Islands had an outbreak in 2007, and the French Polynesian island had an outbreak in 2014 as well. So this is not a virus that we haven't known about. It just hasn't necessarily been on our radar until last year when it hit South America. And one of the reasons why it's took off so much in South America is in a lot of these, specifically the Pacific Island countries, a lot of these places kind of have smaller communities, so there just wasn't a large amount of numbers to kind of escalate it as much as we saw in kind of in Rio and Brazil and some of these other countries where it's happening in kind of their denser cities. So with regards to the United States, as of April 2017, we had 5,234 cases of Zynga reported. 223 of those were locally acquired. So there's 2 places in here in the United States where they have found Zynga actively being transmitted via mosquitoes biting a person. And that was down in South Florida and now in Brownsville, Texas. The majority of our cases are travel-associated cases. So these are cases where people have gone someplace and have gotten bitten by a mosquito and they've come back. As well as those, we also have 46 cases of sexual transmission spread. So this is a partner has it, and they then engage in intercourse, and they don't use protection, and they transmit it to their other partner. To be safe, the Center for Disease Control says that if you have contracted Zynga, you should use protection when engaging in sexual activities for up to 6 months afterwards, just to be safe. They basically found out that it could be transmitted sexually when a gentleman from Europe came back from vacation and ended up giving it to his wife and his girlfriend. And they were like, oh, you can transmit this sexually. And then they continued to kind of test him over the course of time after his trip and found that it took about 4 to 6 months for the virus to fully work its way out of his system. So we also had 13 cases of Gilberian syndrome, and in the United States, there were 38 infants born with microcephaly, which is the brain birth defect. So again, it's transmitted mainly through mosquitoes, but unprotected sex is another possibility that could be. So 45 days after infection, you're still able to transmit it to your partner. So you want to make sure that you always wear a condom if you can, or you should always wear a condom. Blood transfusions. So there hasn't been a case where they found it in blood transfusions yet, but there is the slight possibility of it. And then mother to baby is another possibility of there as well. Most people, actually 80%, who got infected with the Zynga virus didn't have any symptoms show at all. And the 20% that did have symptoms tend to just have flu and cold-like symptoms for about a week. So people just thought it was like a nasty cold. But what we did see was there was this rise in microcephaly in babies, and then in Gallagher syndrome in kind of people as well. So it's just something to be careful of. If you're traveling to a country that is likely to have Zynga, you want to make sure that you take insect repellent and that you take the precautions to prevent contracting it if all possible. Okay, so the less popular but still was in the news a few years ago and still pops up in the news quite often is West Nile virus. 60 species of mosquitoes are known to carry it. The Asian tiger one's the most common one. There were over 40,000 cases of people having it between 1999 and 2014, and over 1,765 deaths because of West Nile virus. In 2016, we had 2,038 cases in the United States of it. And as you can see from the map of the United States off to the side here, basically every place but Maine and Vermont had a case of West Nile virus that was in humans. I didn't include them in here, but Alaska and Hawaii were also in green. So you basically, it's every place you are. And more importantly, it can lead to West Nile encephalitis, which is kind of a more severe version of it. So just like with the triple E, birds are your reservoir in this case. So mosquitoes will feed on birds, and then they'll feed on other birds, and they'll contract the virus through that. And then it's when they come and feed on humans or other mammals that the virus will actually kind of start being more pathogen-like. This one does feed on a wide variety of mammals, from horses, dogs, cattle, pigs, all of those kinds of things. The virus can infect. Just like Zynga, most humans don't develop symptoms. The few that do tend to end up with flu-like symptoms. The big issue is that there's a small percentage of people where when the virus infects them, it'll work its way into their central nerve system, and this will cause encephalitis and can eventually cause things like brain damage, which in return will lead to death kind of later on. So it's definitely something to be weary of as well. And then horses are also pretty susceptible to it. It's very similar to triple E, and there is a vaccine for your horses for it as well. So if you're a horse person, you probably have your horses already vaccinated for it. So okay, so this is when I would normally take questions, but since we still got ticks, to cover. Again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. My email is right down here at eszobel@umd.edu. Here's some resources on where I got this information from. So feel free to send me any questions you have about mosquitoes. And we're going to go ahead and keep moving on to do ticks. Ticks. Okay. So a lot of people think that ticks are insects, but they are in fact arachnids. So where an insect would have 3 body parts and 6 legs, ticks have 1 body part and will have 6 to 8 legs. So they're kind of their own separate thing. They are not in with insects. They're kind of more closely related to spiders, but they're also kind of their own separate group as well. So they are obligated blood feeders. So unlike mosquitoes, where we were talking about, where they feed, they filter feed as larvae, and then as adults they get most of their nutrition from pollen. Ticks only feed on blood. It's the only thing they eat. They are vampires truly all the way through. They are obligated blood feeders. There are over 90 species of ticks in the United States. They can generally be grouped into what we call hard ticks, which have the plate on their back called scrotum, or soft ticks, which tend to be more wrinkly. The soft-bodied ticks tend to be found in kind of the southwest and more warmer environment. Here in the mid-Atlantic, specifically in Maryland, we only have the hard ticks, and we actually only have 5 tick species that are found here as well. And they are fairly small animals. They're about the size as adults when they haven't been feeding. They're about the size of a poppy seed, so very, very tiny. And you can see up here the picture. So the one on the left is a larvae, and then it's a nymph, and then it's an adult male, and an adult female. So you can see them all on your finger. Super tiny, hard to see. Okay, so their life cycle. So this is another place that they kind of vary from insects because they've got this 4-stage life cycle where they initially, they'll start out as an egg, and that egg will hatch, and they will be a 6-legged larvae. They will take their first blood meal. It'll normally be on something kind of like a small mammal, like a rodent or a bird, sometimes reptiles or amphibians. After they've taken this blood meal, they will fall off of the animal normally, and then they will find some leaf litter someplace, and they will kind of go into a hibernational state, and they'll end up molting. After they molt, they will then hunt down, they will be an 8-legged nymph, and then from there, they're going to try to find another host. This is the stage where they'll kind of have the greatest variation in their hosts. A lot of times, they're not. Some species are kind of very generalist, some are very specific on the kind of host they want, but most of the ones here in the Mid-Atlantic are generalist. So they're going to just look for anything that they can kind of feed on. If it's a mouse or a bird or a dog or a cat or you or me, they tend to be good with it. They'll do the same thing. They'll attach, they'll feed, they'll drop off into leaf litter, they'll molt, and then they will take another blood meal as an adult, find a partner to mate with, and then the female will go off and lay her eggs, and then she'll die. Most tick species end up being multi-year. Most of them are about 2 years for them to do their full life cycle. They can overwinter in any or all of these stages, and they are required to basically take these 3 blood meals during their life stage. They will vary in the number and types of their hosts. So the general life cycle that I just gave is kind of a really common one, but you do have a handful of tick species that, for instance, the larvae will find an animal and it will stay on that animal throughout its entire nymph stage, and then after its blood meal as an adult, then it will fall off. So sometimes they do have some variation in there. So ticks in winter. So a lot of people think like, oh, it's winter, there are no ticks outside, but they would be wrong. So the blacklegged, also known as the deer tick, is not killed by freezing temperature. In fact, most ticks aren't killed by freezing temperatures. They're active anytime the temperature is above freezing. More than likely, when you're more than likely going to find them when the ground has thawed and the temperature is above freezing. When it's below freezing, while they can live, they don't necessarily have the energy to move their muscles. Again, they're not generating their own heat like we are, so they're really relying on the temperature around them to create the to allow their muscles to kind of move. So when it's above freezing, that's when they can move. When it's below freezing, they're really kind of clenched up. So ticks feeding habits. So ticks feed by what we call questing. So a lot of people think that like, oh, you have to wear a hat when you're hiking in the woods or you're hunting or something because the ticks will fall down from the trees and get onto your head. This is not true. Ticks do not fall off of trees. They don't fly, they don't jump, they don't fall. What they do is they do something called questing. So they'll basically climb up to the tip of grass or out onto the edges of leaves, and they'll hold their first pair of legs out straight, and they'll cling onto the plant with their back pairs of legs, and they'll wait until a host comes by, and when the host brushes them, they will basically grab on with their front pair of legs, let go of the branch or the grass or the leaf with their back pair, and they will crawl on very, very quickly. You tend to find them up in around your head and your hair because that's a good hiding place for them, but they generally get on you someplace between the bottom, between like your ankle up to like your chest. And then they just will continue to climb until they find an ideal place for them to feed. They have this really gnarly looking mouthpiece. So these two, if you look at their mouth, so these two things off to the side are actually not part of their mouth. These are their polyps, and they basically use this to keep their sheath in place, but it's not actually part of their mouth. They have a three-part sheath sword mouthpiece, which you can kind of see. So this, the yellow thing on there is the actual mouthpiece, and then the little brown thing on the top is the sheath, and there'll be a sheath on the bottom. So what they basically do is the sheath will basically move forward and will cover the sword area. It will slide in, and then they'll pull the sheath back, and then they'll kind of wiggle their mouth in because it's got those nice serrated edges, basically to hunker down and to hold on. This is why when a tick gets its head in you, it's so hard to get them off, is because of this mouth. This basically serrated sword mouth is really hanging in. And unlike a mosquito that wants to come in and get a quick meal and get out, ticks really want to stick around and enjoy the all-you-can-eat blood buffet for as long as possible. So most ticks want to feed for about 3 to 7 days. And you can see from this diagram that they can truly engorge themselves for 3 to 7 days, and they get much, much larger. Like compared to the unfed one, we're talking like, multiple times their body size as they're feeding. Okay, so most ticks don't actually aren't born carrying the disease pathogens. What normally happens is when they're a larvae or when they're a nymph and they take those blood males, they fed on a host that has the pathogen. And because they are feeding for a longer period of time and they're feeding on so much blood, their likelihood of them getting the pathogen, if the pathogen is in one of these hosts, kind of increases. So the diagram here off to the side shows the blacklegged or the deer tick, and this kind of really points out Lyme disease, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But normally, so the reservoir for Lyme disease is white-footed mice. So when the larvae feeds on an infected white-footed mouse, and then in return it comes and feeds on you as a nymph, that's how you get it. It's not born with it; it contracts it from mice. So that's one of the reasons when we talk about controlling Lyme disease and other diseases, mouse control is a critical part in there. Likewise, if it didn't have it as a larvae, and it can also contract it as a nymph, and then as an adult, it could feed and give it to humans. In the case of the black-legged tick or the deer tick, they actually prefer deer as their adult host. So again, we'll talk about controlling deer as a way of preventing ticks, and it's because a lot of ticks like deer as their final host as well. So when a tick is feeding, it does take 36 to 48 hours in order for them to transmit a disease to you. And that's basically because unlike a mosquito where the disease is in the saliva gland, it's not actually in the saliva gland in ticks. So in most cases, the pathogen is in the tick's gut. So it would be here in the gut. And then once the tick starts to feed and blood starts moving into the gut and then into the body, this allows the pathogen to then kind of work its way up to the saliva glands and then into the host. So again, it takes about 36 to 48 hours for the pathogen to get transmitted to you. So if you find a tick crawling on you that hasn't fed, you're generally okay if you can get it off. When we talk about tick removal, we'll talk about the fact that you can leave the heads in, which is not good. But again, if it hasn't been feeding for 38 hours, the idea is you want to get the body off of you because the body's what's holding the pathogen. So just like mosquitoes, personal protection is kind of the best way to go about controlling ticks for at least you. Long pants, long sleeves. Do what I call the fabulous hiker look, as you can see here. So tuck your shirt into your pants and your pants into your socks. Clothes treated with pyrethrum is also another great option. So pyrethrum basically, not only does it work to kind of prevent mosquitoes, but when ticks get in contact with it, it kind of causes a muscle spasm and they clench up. And depending on how much of a dosage they get, sometimes it'll kill them, sometimes they'll just clench up and then they'll fall off. But it's also really effective because then they're not on you and your clothes. And you can buy clothes either pre-treated with pyrethrum, or you can get pyrethrum at Walmart or sporting goods stores and so forth and treat it yourself. And you want to make sure that even with all this personal protective, that you check for ticks after you've been in a tick habitat. So if you've been tromping through the woods or wheat fields, corn fields, soybean fields, all ideal tick habitats. So you want to check, and not only yourself, but kids and pets are like tick magnets. They just have really good blood, I guess. So make sure you check them for ticks as well. On open skin, DEET is pretty much the best thing that you can use. Again, sunscreen first, never under clothes, and never on your pets. Just on your open skin. Lint roll brushes are amazing for picking up ticks. So if you have been in a hiking through the woods, or a lot of times when I go and survey people's fields, I keep a lint roll brush in my car, and the first thing I do when I come back is I lint roll my entire body down because the lint roll brush is particularly good at picking up tiny little things. And a lot of times, particularly, if the adults are the size of a poppy seed, the larvae and the nymphs are even smaller than that, and they will stick to the lint roll brush really, really easily. When you get home, shower as soon as possible, and then you want to throw clothes in the dryer for about 5 to 10 minutes before you wash them. Basically, the heat will kill any ticks that are on them, and then when you wash them, they will get pushed away in the wash. Ticks, depending on how aggressive your washing machine are, may or may not come off in the wash on their own. So if you've got kind of your really grubby farm clothes, if you've been tromping through wheat fields or dealing with brush piles and stuff, 5 minutes in the dryer and then boom, right into the washer and you're good. So around your house, you want to try to remove tick habitats. So keeping your grass nicely mowed, leaf litter around forest edge is a really great place for them. Avoid overwatering. They like that nice humid kind of puddly environment as well. And cedar mulch is another great thing. They do not particularly like cedar. It gives off a very, the fragrance that it gives off is kind of a good deterrent from them. So just doing something like this did. Obviously, you can't do this around all of your farms, but for instance, around like if you've got your house and you've got your backyard and then some forest area around it, and then your fields off to the side or what have you, trying to clean up a little bit around mainly where your kids or your pets will be is kind of worth your time. A 3-foot barrier of wood chips or gravel between wooded areas, removing plants and leaf litter, particularly like right around your house. Not only is this good to help with kind of drainage around your house, but it'll reduce the amount of ticks that are just right around there. Some people wanted to have, don't put your playground equipment or your decks right in forest edges, kind of keep them further away, and then if all possible, limit kind of wildlife that comes running through. So if you've got kind of like a wood pile like in this picture, keeping your wood pile nice and stacked in a dry area will reduce the amount of mice that are kind of habitating in it, which will reduce the probability of kind of ticks being in or around your home. So, environmental reduction. So again, you could exclude deer. Haha, right? If only it were that easy. Well, doing things like a deer fence or deer repellents, because deer tend to be the preferred adult host. A lot of times the adults will come in on a deer, and then when they get done feeding and they fall off, that's where they'll lay their eggs, and that's where you'll get a flush of the nymphs. So if you can exclude deer, that's preferred. Reducing the rodent habitat is another good one because, again, the rodents, particularly for Lyme disease, are the main vector there. So stacking wood neatly in a dry area away from your home. And don't overstock bird feeders. Clean up any fallen seed. In the event you live someplace, like everyone kind of has mice, especially on a farm, what you can do is you can get these tick tubes that are these green tubes, and they basically have cotton that has been treated with pyrethrum. It's okay for the mice, but they'll come back and they'll make their little nest, and then any ticks that come in on them will basically die. You can also be very pro biocontrol. Barn cats are great for this. Black rat snakes, and then birds of prey are also incredibly good for taking care of our little furry white-footed mouse friends that no one really likes. Okay, so control around your farm. Keeping wood weeds down around the edges of the field is a great one. Ticks do not like that dry, grassy area, so if you keep it mowed, the likelihood of them coming out of the field and naturally migrating into your fields is dramatically reduced. Likewise, you don't want to plant right up to your forest edge. 5 to 6 foot gap. Any farm animals that you have, ear tags, bats, repellents, all that stuff. It'll keep the animals happier, and then you don't have to worry about vector diseases and all that stuff. You can also vaccinate them for a lot of these diseases, and then you can exclude wildlife, both living and dead. Again, if only excluding deer were as easy or as cheap, deer fence can be, incredibly useful, but they're expensive. A lot of times you will have farmers who will, they'll shoot deer in their fields and then they'll just leave them in their fields, and they'll say, well, I didn't want to move the carcass because I didn't want the ticks, jumping off to me. And well, that's true, but when you leave it in the middle of your field, those ticks won't return spread out in the middle of that field. So sometimes you're better off, excuse me, just putting on a good pair of work gloves, dragging that dead carcass back into the woods and just leaving it there. And then again, taking the precautions to know that, like, okay, I may have been exposed to ticks, so now I'm going to lint roll that myself. I'm going to wash my hands really well. I'm going to do a tick check. All those precautions are really good at that point. So yeah, don't leave dead animals in your field. Okay, so there's various chemicals that you can use. Most of these will last from about 2 weeks to 3 months. You can apply them either as liquid or granular. Here's a long list of them. If you want to go more organic or environmental friendly, dichotomous earth works really well. However, it does not have the, it's got about a medium lasting power in there as well. So these are all options for it, but these only work in kind of the smaller area. So they work to offer protection when you're in the protected areas. Okay. Hang on one sec. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. I'm getting over a cold, so I'm doing all that, like, snotty hacking stuff. Okay. So how to remove a tick. So you want to remove it as soon as possible. There were lots of kind of urban legends about how to go about doing this. You put Vaseline on it, you use liquid soap, you take alcohol and put it on a cotton ball on top of it, you touch it with a hot match. None of that's actually useful, and you don't really want to do any of that, particularly the hot match, because a hot match is basically going to just cause the tick to vomit back up any blood that it's consumed. And since the pathogens are in the stomach, if it vomits up all that blood back into you, it's basically giving you any pathogens it's got. So instead, what you want to do is grab a very sharp pair of fine-tuned tweezers, grasp the tick as close to your skin, and pull the body straight away. It's okay if the tick's head or mouth parts remain in your skin. Your body will naturally work its way out, or you can go see a doctor and they can remove it. But the idea is once the body is removed from the head, you've basically cut that timeline that the pathogen can get into you. The tick's not the issue, it's any potential pathogens that are the issues. What you then want to do is take a piece of clear sticky tape, stick the tick in it, double it over so you've sealed it, and then put it in your freezer. Your freezer, again, is not going to kill the tick, but the idea here is that you're going to preserve it. By putting it in the tape and pressing down around the tape, you potentially wind up suffocating the tick later on, and by freezing it, you're going to preserve any pathogens that are in it. So in the event you do end up having a rash or any kind of aches and pains, when you go to the doctor, you can take the tick with you. It's a lot easier to find the pathogens inside of a tick than inside of you. Okay, so now we're going to talk tick ID. And while ticks are engorged, they all kind of look the same, and they are rather small. But the best way to tell what species of a tick you are dealing with is by looking at the scrotum, which is that shield right above their head. So their head is right here, and this is the scrotum right here. So in a blacklegged or a deer tick, they aren't going to be nice and round. In the Lone Star tick, they're kind of more triangular, and they have that yellow dot right at the top. That's the Lone Star. The brown dog tick is a little bit more ovalish, and it's kind of a little bit wavier. So if you compare it to the black-legged tick, where the black-legged is kind of this really nice, crisp circle, the brown dog is kind of more of an ovally shape, and it's kind of uneven. It's also that richer brown color versus kind of the black of the deer tick. And then the American dog tick kind of has this really interesting white and black pattern. Again, if you're not from the Mid-Atlantic region or Maryland, you can check with your local extension office, and they can probably tell you what ticks are native to you, and from there you can do some online research and figure out how to go about identifying them. But pretty much all hard-bodied ticks have kind of a scrotum that's kind of distinct to them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart. Most of this information came from the University of Rhode Island. They have a Tick Encore Resource Center where you can go and you can look up your area and you can see what ticks are native and figure out what diseases they transmit and when they're active and what their habitat is. If you live in the Mid-Atlantic area and you would like a copy of this, you can shoot me an email. I have it, and I would be more than happy to send it to you as a PDF. So then you can print it out and post it. The tick that was not included above was the Gulf Coast tick, which is this one right here. They're basically only found in southern Maryland, in St. Mary's County, and it's the southern half of St. Mary's County, so I didn't include them in it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to tick diseases. Just like with mosquitoes, I am not a trained doctor. If you think you have any of these diseases or have any questions about them, you should seek a medical professional and talk about them with them. Okay. So here's a list of common tick vector diseases in the United States. Lyme disease is the most common one, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and then these other ones, we're only going to touch on some of these as well, again, because we've got limited amount of time. But you can go on the Center for Disease Control's website, and they basically have information about all of these. So the first one I kind of want to touch on is tick paralysis. This is not actually a pathogen. This basically, when you have a female adult tick who feeds, one thing that she can do is she kind of creates a neurotoxin, and on human adults, this isn't necessarily a big deal, but kids and pets and livestock sometimes are more sensitive to this neurotoxin, and it'll basically affect the nerve system. And it's normally one she's been feeding long-term wise. And basically what happens is neurotoxin causes paralysis. So the person at first will start feeling very tired, and then they'll normally start feeling numbness in their legs or in their fingers. And then from there, it'll slowly work its way up their body or up their arms. If left untreated, it can really, your tongue and their facial can go into it. It's very rare, but there have been a few cases where it hasn't gotten treated at all, and then they basically went into respiratory failure and they died because of this. But the good news is as soon as the tick is removed, the symptoms start diminishing pretty rapidly. And this is most predominantly found in your pets, so dogs, cats, particularly young ones, so puppies, kittens, your smaller livestock, and kids. So kids normally under the age of like 5 or 6 is the real crucial thing here. Again, because women particularly have multiple roles on farms, and we're normally the ones who are taking care of pets and kids and stuff. If you do have, a toddler or a small child, and you guys have been out in the field playing or hiking through a field, and then all of a sudden they're complaining about like, "Mommy, I can't feel my feet or I can't feel my hand," do a tick check. This is pretty frightening when it's happening, which is why I wanted you guys to kind of know about it, and it was the first one I decided to talk about today. So just wanted you to know. Okay, so Lyme disease. So this is a multisynotic disease. So this isn't something that's it's super complex. It's caused by the bacteria Borderline borphideus, and it's the most widespread vector-borne disease in the United States. 20,000 to 30,000 people are diagnosed with Lyme disease per year in the United States. You can see over here on the map, all the blue stuff is areas where people have been affected with it. So it's pretty predominant in kind of the northeastern area of the United States. So there is a similar disease, which is vectored by the western blacklegged tick, which is found on kind of the west coast, so Oregon, Washington, California, kind of those states. It's caused by a different bacteria. So it's most people just group them together as Lyme disease and covers both. It's technically a different bacteria, so it's technically called like Southern Lyme disease or Western Lyme disease, but most people just generally refer to it as their own. So in the state of Maryland, in 2014, which is the last time they kind of did a survey of Lyme disease, there was 1,300 cases of Lyme disease in the state of Maryland alone. So when we were the 8th highest population of Lyme disease, which considering we're such a small state kind of says something. So there has been a rise in Lyme disease over time, as you can see from the map here. Okay, so the symptoms. 30 to 50% of people actually don't get the token bullseye rash. Basically what happens is the tick feeds in you and the bacteria gets into you, and then from where it fed, you will start seeing this kind of bullseye rash. And from the bacteria will basically work its way through your body, through your blood system, and it will kind of burrow down into your various tissues, your organs, your joints, heart, brain, bladder, all these other sites. And this makes it particularly complicated because by the time that bullseye appears normally, the bacteria isn't in your bloodstream anymore. It's started to settle down into your tissue. So when doctors are looking to see if you have Lyme disease or not, they're looking for side effects of the bacteria because they can't actually look for the bacteria because no one really wants their doctors coming in and like removing tissues to look for it. So you have to look for the side effects of it in the blood, which makes it a little bit more risky. But the general side effects that people see if you don't get the bullseye, so fatigue, headache, fever, sweats, chills, muscle pains, joint pains, and so forth. So all around kind of crabby issues as well. So post-treatment Lyme disease symptoms. So most people have heard of chronic Lyme disease. The medical community has kind of dubbed that to be an inappropriate term. When you get diagnosed with Lyme disease and you get your doctor's going to give you antibiotics, and he'll check you, and hopefully um, he'll give you enough to kind of treat it, and if not, he'll give you more. So once the Lyme disease is gone, which the majority of the times the antibiotics will take care of, a lot of people will suffer from this, which is post-treatment Lyme disease symptom. So this is the lingering symptoms of the fatigue, the pain, the joints and muscle aches because of the bacteria itself. So because the bacteria was in your joints and it was in your muscles and then it died and it kind of like is still left these like lingering feelings. And sometimes, a lot of times, they'll last more than 6 months. Some people will live with them for the rest of their lives, depending on how severe the case of Lyme disease was, or how sensitive they were to it. So you basically, yeah, so it's this residue damage that's taking place. So the Lyme disease itself is treated. That's why chronic Lyme disease is kind of misleading, because you don't have Lyme disease anymore. You just have the symptoms of having Lyme disease. And what the doctors will normally do is they will treat these symptoms of it. And a lot of times this will involve doing things like, all these different various things. And sometimes people will be like, well, why am I still taking antibiotics if I don't have the actual bacteria in me anymore? And sometimes it's because the doctors want to make sure that they cleared everything up. And sometimes because those antibiotics will kind of cause your body to do certain things that will alleviate some of these symptoms. So there's kind of various different things going on. Again, I'm not a medical professional, so if you're really curious about this, you can go talk to a medical professional about it, or you can email me and I can give you a link to the papers where I kind of read about this. So the other one that kind of pops up here in the Mid-Atlantic area is spotty-mounted Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This is also caused by a bacteria. The American dog tick and the brown dog tick are the ones that transmit it. It is rare in Maryland, but when it has been known to pop up here, it's very distinct because you basically get all these tiny little spots all over you, particularly on your arms and your legs, and they'll normally develop in 2 to 14 days after you've been infected, and it can be fatal if it's not treated. Basically, this infection deals with the lining of your blood cells, and at some point, you'll have bleeding and clotting issues with your brain. And it's very easy to treat. They just treat it with antibiotics, but it is something that if it's happening, it can be very frightening, and it needs to get treated as soon as possible. Okay, barbosis is another one that's transmitted by the blacklegged or deer tick. This is a protozoa, and it basically parasizes your red blood cells. It's more common in animals than in humans, so this is something that's more likely to happen to your cattle or your livestock or your dogs or cats. And the symptoms normally show up more long-term life, so 1 to 6 weeks. It can last a few months. You can treat it with medication. It's got a wide range of symptoms. This isn't one that will necessarily dramatically kill you overnight, but basically none of these symptoms are enjoyable, but the main issue is that it basically causes like long-term liver damage because you've harmed your red blood cells, and then in return you'll end up harming your liver and your spleen and kind of your body in general. So it's something to be wary of, especially if you or your partner or some of your animals seem to be kind of like deteriorating kind of slowly over time, and you can't really justify it going in and just being like, hey, you got bit by a tick last month or last year or something like that, maybe it's this. So that's an option. Okay, so here are some great resources for ticks. I really recommend the University of Rhode Island's Tick Encounter Resource Center. They have some phenomenal information about identifying ticks. They also have it so that if you need a tick identified, you can fill out a form there and mail it away, and they will tell you what type of tick it is. If you are curious about more about both the tick diseases and the mosquito diseases, Center for Disease Control and the National Institute for Health are both really great places to check out. And then the Connecticut Agriculture Experimental Station also has a lot of really good information about ticks. There is my name again, Emily Zobel, and my email address. So feel free to send me any questions that you guys have. Or if you would like a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, you can do that. So thanks for listening, guys. I know we went a little bit over our hour, but I thought this was all pretty useful information, and I hope you guys did too. So thanks so much.